In the lively city of Marrakesh, 14-year-old Hind felt out of place in her English classes. While she loved school and learning, English was a constant struggle. Most of her classes were taught in English, but every lesson felt like a mountain she couldn't climb. She often found herself missing key points or feeling lost in discussions. She watched as classmates raised their hands to answer questions, while she sat silently, hoping she wouldn't be called on. One particularly difficult day, Hind's history teacher asked her a question she didn't understand. As her classmates looked at her, Hind felt her face burn with embarrassment. She mumbled something, her voice barely audible, before the teacher moved on. She wished she could understand more, but each day felt like she was falling further behind. The struggle weighed on her. Her teachers did their best, but they couldn't sit with her individually for long periods. Deep down, Hind knew that if she wanted to keep up with her lessons, she would have to find a way to improve on her own. One afternoon, her homeroom teacher, Mrs. Fiza, introduced a new project called the 1% Challenge. Each student was to choose a personal goal and commit to improving just 1% each day in that area. The goal could be anything, but it needed to be a small, daily effort that they would stick to for a month. Hind's heart sank. She couldn't think of a goal at first. But as the idea sank in, she realized there was something she wanted more than anything: to understand her classes. She decided her 1% challenge would be to improve her English. It felt daunting, but she reminded herself that it was just a small step each day. She committed to reading or listening to English for 5 minutes every evening. She hoped that these little efforts would make English feel less overwhelming. The first few days were challenging. Hind found an old children's book in English and struggled through the first few pages, stumbling over almost every word. She'd look up words she didn't know, jotting down their meanings in a notebook. It was slow and tedious, and part of her wondered if this small effort could really make any difference. But she kept at it, setting a timer for 5 minutes each evening. Gradually, she found herself looking up fewer words as some began to stick. The process was still difficult, but each night she felt a tiny bit more confident. The language wasn't as foreign as it had once seemed. One evening, her younger brother peeked over her shoulder, watching as she read. "You're still reading, Hind?" he asked, surprised. Hind just nodded, determined to keep going. She was starting to enjoy the quiet time, her own private mission to improve. After a few weeks, Hind noticed a small but exciting change. During an English lesson, her teacher used a word she had recently learned in her reading. Instead of feeling lost, Hind understood it immediately. Her heart leapt. She could actually follow along, even if it was only one word. The next week, she began listening to English songs, focusing on picking out words she knew. She couldn't catch everything, but little by little, she understood more. Her friends noticed her effort, and one of them even offered to practice with her after school. Slowly, her small steps were adding up, and she felt the faint stirrings of hope. For the first time, Hind started participating in her English class. She didn't always have the right answers, but she was no longer afraid to try. As the month wore on, the challenge grew harder. Hind found herself busy with other assignments and activities, and one night, she nearly skipped her English practice. But as she reached for her phone, she remembered the promise she had made to herself. It was only 5 minutes. She set her timer and picked up the children's book, pushing through even though she was tired. When she finished, she felt an unexpected sense of accomplishment. She hadn't let herself down, and that small choice gave her a sense of control over her progress. One afternoon, her English teacher, Mrs. Thompson, handed back an essay with a smile. "Hind, your writing has really improved," she said. "It's clear that you're putting in extra effort." Hind could hardly believe it. She had spent only 5 minutes a day, yet she was starting to see the effects. Her teacher's words lit a spark inside her, making her want to work even harder. Her classmates, too, noticed her new confidence and began asking her for help with their own work. Her small, private effort had grown into something more. It wasn't just about understanding English anymore. It was about proving to herself that she could change, that she could reach her goals if she just took one small step each day. But progress wasn't always linear. During a class discussion one day, Hind mispronounced a word, and a few classmates stifled laughs. She felt a familiar wave of embarrassment, her confidence shrinking. For a moment, she thought about giving up, wondering if her efforts even mattered. That evening, as she looked at her English book, she almost didn't pick it up. But then she thought about all the small wins she had already achieved and remembered why she had started. She wasn't just doing this for school. She was doing it for herself. She took a deep breath, opened her book, and continued her challenge. By the end of the semester, Hind's progress was undeniable. She could read passages in English without stumbling over every other word, and she understood more of what her teachers said in class. Her English grades had improved significantly, and she could keep up with class discussions without feeling lost. One day, Mrs. Faiza invited Hind to speak to the class about her experience with the 1% challenge. Nervous but proud, Hind stood up and shared her story. "I used to think that understanding English was impossible for me," she began. "But I learned that small daily effort makes a huge difference. Even when it felt like nothing was changing, I kept going. And now, I understand things I never thought I would." Her classmates listened with admiration, and several of them began clapping, inspired by her determination. Hind realized that she had become an example of what dedication and consistency could achieve. Hind kept her habit of practicing English even after the 1% challenge ended. Her newfound confidence spilled over into other areas of her life, and she began setting small goals for her other subjects. She knew now that personal effort could create real change, and that relying solely on others wasn't enough. She had learned the importance of taking ownership of her learning. As she continued on her journey, Hind felt a quiet pride, knowing that she had transformed not through any big change, but through the power of small, steady steps. She had become her own teacher, realizing that her future was shaped by her own choices. And with each small effort, she knew she was building the life she had once only dreamed of, 1% improvement at a time.